In 1670, one of the most respected men in Edinburgh stood up in the middle of a prayer meeting and announced that he was a servant of the devil. The room went silent, and then they laughed, because Major Thomas Weir wasn't an outcast or eccentric. He was a war hero, a man so devout that strangers would travel across the city just to hear him pray. But Weir wasn't joking. The Lord Provost tried to have him quietly assessed and sent home. Weir kept going. The clergy visited and urged him to reconsider. Weir kept going. At some point, it must have dawned on everyone that he wasn't going to stop confessing. He insisted he hadn't even told them the worst of it. And when the Lord Provost finally had no choice but to listen, he kept confessing to crimes so extreme that even the court records hesitated to name them plainly. Incredibly, his sister backed up every word. She even added details, claiming she bore an inherited mark of the devil on her forehead and that Thomas carried one on his body. This would become one of the most notorious cases in Scottish criminal history, but it's not a story about persecution. It's a story about a man who destroyed himself, and we still don't know why. Hi, I'm Harriet. Welcome back to the channel. So I wasn't looking for this story. I was researching Scottish supernatural cases for another video, and I kept seeing Thomas Weir's name appear, so I decided to do some digging. If you picture Edinburgh in the 1670s, you have to forget the modern open spaces and tourist crowds for a moment. This was a vertical city, packed tightly inside its walls. Narrow closes twisted down from the high street, and tenements climbed several stories high, with families living stacked on top of each other. And on the West Bow lived a man that people called a saint. What draws me to this case isn't just the shock of his confession, although it's pretty bad. It's also the transformation. How does someone go from Bowhead Saint to self-declared servant of the devil entirely by his own choice? And why did the story grow larger after his death? So let's start with who he was before everything unravelled. Thomas Weir was born around 1599 in Lanarkshire into minor gentry. His father was Laird of Kirkton, and his mother, Jean Somerville, was said to have the second sight. In Scotland at the time, that kind of reputation wasn't automatically disreputable. It simply meant your family carried a certain air of the uncanny. Weir became a soldier and aligned himself firmly with the Presbyterian cause at the time. He signed the Solemn League and Covenant and served in Ulster during the Irish Rebellion of 1641. By 1650, he'd risen to command the Edinburgh Town Guard and held the rank of Major. He even escorted the Marquis of Montrose through the streets to his execution, and the city watched. He stood for order and religious certainty. He wasn't a fringe figure drifting at the edge of events. He was part of the machinery of power. After his military career ended, he settled on the West Bow with his unmarried sister Jean, and wherever he went, he carried a black thornwood staff. Now, some later accounts claimed it was carved with strange heads, while others described it more simply as dark and polished by years of use. Everyone agreed he rarely prayed without it. The staff became as much a part of his presence as his voice. People gathered outside his home to listen to it. On a still evening, you could hear him from the street. Neighbours said his prayers had a quality they couldn't quite name, something that rose and fell like music, that made you feel like you were standing at the edge of something large. If 4 Presbyterians met together, people used to joke, Major Weir would almost certainly be one of them. They called him Angelical Thomas and the Bowhead Saint. No one suspected that anything was wrong, at least not publicly. Around 1651, a woman near Newmilns claimed she had witnessed Major Thomas Weir committing an act so degrading that even the surviving records hesitate to describe it plainly. It involved his mare. She reported what she'd seen, and instead of being believed, she was publicly whipped through the town for slander. It tells you how powerful reputation could be in 17th century Scotland. His status absorbed the shock and redirected it outward. For nearly 2 decades, the story disappeared. Weir continued to lead prayers and continued to be admired. The Bowhead Saint remained untouchable until he chose to speak. The story goes that in early 1670, Thomas fell ill. From his sickbed, he began to confess. No one was forcing him, no one had accused him, and there was no trial looming over him. He just initiated it himself. Now think about what that means. He was 70 years old. He'd lived his entire public life as a man of God. No one was coming for him and no one suspected anything. And he still chose to speak out. He confessed to incest with his sister Jean, claiming it had begun when she was young and continued for decades. He confessed to incest with his stepdaughter, to adultery, to years of exploitation. He admitted to acts with animals and spoke of powers that came not from God, but from the devil. The authorities assumed he had lost his mind. Doctors examined him, declared him intellectually sound, and found no delirium and no obvious disorder, which made it much harder to dismiss, which for the Lord Provost was probably the worst possible outcome. He initially took no action, perhaps hoping the scandal would just fade, but Weir refused to let it fade and insisted he hadn't even revealed a fraction of his crimes. And then his sister began to speak more, and that's when the story shifted. Because Jean didn't confirm what Thomas had said, she built on it. She gave it mythology. Their mother, she said, had been a witch, and knowledge had passed down to her children. They'd signed a pact with the devil at Musselburgh. She even described journeys in a fiery coach drawn by 6 horses, travelling to Dalkeith, where Thomas received news of Scotland's defeat at the Battle of Worcester with what she said was supernatural speed. She spoke of the Queen of Fairy and of a familiar spirit that worked beside her spinning wheel at night, producing extraordinary amounts of yarn. Neighbours had wondered how she managed to produce such yarn, and now she supplied an answer that placed her squarely inside the language of witchcraft. In 17th century Scotland, fairy belief hadn't vanished, but continued quietly alongside Presbyterian theology. The two worldviews were not always openly in conflict, but they never fully settled comfortably beside one another. The fairy world was simply thought to overlap the human one, a parallel realm that brushed up against daily life in small and unsettling ways. Stories of people taken by the fair folk or gifted strange knowledge still circulated, particularly in rural communities. When Jean spoke of the Queen of Fairy, she was drawing on a belief system people already recognised. The detail about her spinning was important as well. Spinning was domestic and measurable. Yarn could be counted and compared. If neighbours had wondered how she managed to produce so much thread, and apparently they had, which tells you something about Edinburgh at the time, the suggestion of supernatural assistance offered an explanation that aligned suspicion with folklore. She also warned the authorities to seize Thomas's black staff, claiming it was the source of his power and the instrument of his pact. When the guards came to arrest him, they took it. What fascinates me here is that Jean wasn't dragged into this story reluctantly. She elaborated on it. She gave the confession structure and symbolism. She transformed what might have remained a moral scandal into something that fitted the supernatural imagination of the time. So when the trial opened in April 1670, Thomas Weir was charged with sexual crimes, while Jean faced charges of sorcery and conversing with a familiar spirit. The main evidence was their own testimony, and in an era where confessions were often extracted by force, theirs had been volunteered. But they weren't the only ones who spoke. Thomas's other sister, Margaret, testified that she'd seen Thomas and Jean naked in bed together. His stepdaughter, also a Margaret, corroborated the incest claim against herself. They both confirmed it independently, under oath, in open court. Clergy visited Thomas in prison and urged him to repent. He refused, insisting he felt nothing within himself but blackness and burning, as though damnation was already certain. At one point he reportedly said, "I bless the Lord that he hath discovered my sin." That line is striking. It's not denial and panic. It's acknowledgement without appeal. On the morning of the 11th of April, he was taken to Greenside, just outside the city boundary near the top of what is now Leith Walk, to be strangled and burned. Considering some of the methods they used at the time, this was ironically probably one of the more humane. When asked to seek mercy, witnesses record him saying, "I have lived as a beast, and I must die as a beast." And when they cast him into the flames, they threw his staff in as well. Later accounts claimed it twisted in the fire and burned slowly. Whether that detail reflects the way Thornwood reacts to heat or the imagination of those watching, the image endured. His remains were then taken to the Galilee, a stretch of open ground further down the road towards Leith, and displayed on a gibbet, a kind of post where the remains of the condemned were hung in public view, sometimes for months, and denied burial. The point wasn't just punishment, it was total erasure. He had no grave or marker. The following day, Jean was hanged in the grass market. It was over by April, but Edinburgh wasn't finished with him just yet. Unsurprisingly, after the executions, the Weir house on the West Bow stood empty for years. In a place like Edinburgh's Old Town, emptiness rarely went unnoticed. Buildings pressed against one another and lives overlapped through thin walls, so a vacant house quickly became part of the conversation. People claimed they heard footsteps inside and reported the steady tap of a staff striking stone. The tapping was unsettling for a specific reason. It echoed the object everyone already associated with him. What had once been visible in his hand during prayer meetings returned as a sound in the dark. There were also stories of a fiery coach drawing up outside at night. The image came directly from Jean's own testimony, or what was recorded of it. Around 1780, an ex-soldier named William Patullo and his wife moved into the house, tempted by the low rent. I imagine they got what they paid for. According to an account later repeated by Sir Walter Scott, of all people, they had just gone to bed when something appeared in their room. It wasn't a human figure at all, but a calf that walked calmly to the foot of the bed, placed its forelegs on the board, and stared at them in silence. They left the next morning and never returned. And I find that detail oddly specific. Not a figure, not a sound, but a calf staring at them. Scott later wrote that no tale of witchcraft in Edinburgh left such a lasting impression as that of Major Weir. Robert Louis Stevenson even grew up hearing the story. His father told it to him as a child. The strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a pillar of the community, concealing a monstrous secret life, has been proposed as directly influenced by Weir's story. Stevenson never confirmed it, but the parallel is difficult to ignore. Even when the house was eventually demolished, some researchers suggested part of its structure may have been absorbed into later buildings, and that somewhere beneath modern Edinburgh, the walls that once held those prayers and confessions might still stand. When I think about this case, I don't see the courtroom first. I see West Bow at night, 17th century stone rising on either side, windows dark and wind moving through the close, and a tall man walking alone with a black staff striking cobblestones. We don't know why he did it. We never will. He went to his death without explanation and without appeal, and the question he left behind is one that has kept this story alive for 350 years. So what do you think? If you've got any thoughts or theories about this case, please let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear them. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing or even becoming a member. It does help me out a lot. I'll see you next time.